Furie is a Vietnamese action film, and it was actually the first Vietnamese-made film to be released in the United States. When I first heard about Furie, I wondered if it would serve as the Raid for Vietnam. The Raid was a badass action film that can be single-handedly credited with opening up the Indonesian film scene to the rest of the world. The Raid wasn't the first good action film to come out of Indonesia, but it was the first that really broke out of its origin country and found a loving home with the world at large. If you've been following action films closely in recent years, you will have definitely noticed that a number of Eastern countries are all searching for The Raid. Just look to Buy Bust from the Philippines for another example. That's a film I'll be covering in another video at some point. Or if you want an example that actually predates The Raid, you can look at what Ong Bak did for the Thailand film scene. A solid action flick can be exactly what a country needs to put its film industry on the cinematic map. Action crosses borders, and it leaves an impression regardless of any language or cultural barriers. It's as simple as that. So, is Furie Vietnam's The Raid? Well, that's without a doubt the intention. The real question is, does Furie succeed in that goal? And time will tell, but my guess is maybe. It's not as surefire an answer as it was with Ong Bak or The Raid. It's not as jaw-dropping, game-changing, or wildly different. But there is plenty of merit to it. The plot of Furie follows Veronica Ngo as a former gangster, current debt collector, who's trying to raise her daughter as a single parent. Her daughter is kidnapped by shady people from her past, and then the rest of the film is basically just a mad dash to recover her safely. The plot is quite simple and similar to Taken, and I was also reminded at times of Pound of Flesh, that largely unnoteworthy JCVD action flick with just the one standout moment where Van Damme does a split against a moving car. The clear highlight is Veronica Ngo in the lead role. She is fantastic and hopefully helms many more action films, or just films in general, moving forward. She's good in the fights, but is most impressive in the dramatic beats in between those fights. The plot is just as stock as you might expect from such a simple action premise, but the lead performance greatly elevates the material. She imbues every dramatic exchange with so much more vulnerability and feeling than most action stars ever even attempt. There's one big crying scene, not exactly unlike Stallone's big crying scene at the end of First Blood, and Veronica Ngo absolutely knocks it out of the park. She adds serious emotional depth to what would otherwise be a pretty shallow character. The daughter character is also well performed. Always good to see a strong performance from a young actor. None of the other actors go beyond being just fine. There's a cop character with a pretty significant role, and while his performance wasn't bad, it did leave a lot to be desired, given his prominence in the film especially. This cop character comes across as woefully underwritten, and though the performer handles himself well in the action, you never buy him as the badass that they try to present him as. Getting into the action itself now, it's good, but it's not great, except for a couple of short sequences toward the end that do rise to that higher level that I had hoped the rest of the film would be on. The final one-on-one confrontation is great, and it is also effectively cathartic. There's only one short bit of gunplay at the very end, but it had me wishing for more because it was excellently handled. Aside from the sound effects, but I'll talk more about sound effects momentarily. There are a handful of badass moments sprinkled throughout, and that helps redeem some of the lesser action. The camera work on the fight scenes is solid, and it definitely does feel like it's pulling inspiration from The Raid. But I consider that a good thing. It's definitely not a bad thing to try to mimic the camera work of the Raids. They're like the gold standard of action film camera work. For Fury, they actually brought in a French action team to handle the choreography, the performer training, and the stunt coordination. In interviews with this French action team, they say that their schedule was incredibly rushed, and they didn't really have enough time to iron out all of the action completely. I would have liked to have seen what those action sequences would have looked like if time and money were lesser obstacles. I wouldn't go as far as say that the action looks cheap or incomplete, but I do think that the time crunch does show to a degree in a couple of the earlier action set pieces. The fights involve some brutal elements at times, cleavers slamming down on hands, saw blades being pressed into throats, but the film feels afraid to fully commit to the violence. There's hardly any blood, even when a fight involves giant knives and people getting slashed up. I felt like I was watching a censored-for-TV version, and on IMDb, the film is actually listed as TV-14 as its rating. I decided to do a little research into the Vietnamese censorship board, since I figured that was probably responsible. What I found is that many Vietnamese producers live in fear of the censorship boards. Their regulations are described as general and vague, and the power they have is nearly absolute. I found an article on one particular Vietnamese-made film called Cho Lon's Gangsters, and that film was actually pulled from screenings and threatened with a permanent ban unless significant cuts were made. The censorship board was quoted saying this: "The film, quote, contains elements of violence which does not reflect the social reality of Vietnam, so the film cannot be popularized," end quote. That's a worrying level of censorship. Not cool. From what I understand, this is a fairly common occurrence in Vietnam's as yet underdeveloped film industry. So this was likely the case with Furie as well, which is pretty unfortunate for an action film of this nature. I have the Blu-ray, and I think it would have been cool to see an uncensored cut on here if one exists, but no luck. There's a fight early on where our protagonist gets stabbed in the shoulder, and I would have liked to have seen that factor into her fighting moving forward. You know, show the pain associated with that wound. Maybe she has less mobility with that arm, or maybe an enemy uses that to get an advantage over her. This is something that the Raid films and movies like John Wick do very well. But no, it doesn't seem to have any impact on her at all, even though the untreated stab wound is showing through her shirt for the rest of the movie. She even gets treated in a hospital at one point for other injuries, and apparently they didn't think to treat her stab wound while she was there. They didn't even put a Band-Aid on it. They just left it wide open. It would be kind of funny if she ended up saving the day, rescuing her kid, and then just died of an infection like a month later because she never got that stab wound patched up. Then there's a point where she ends up getting shot toward the end of the film. And my little problem with this is that the spot she gets shot in is right above the prominently placed shoulder wound. That seems to have no impact on her at all, but the gunshot is like life-threatening. It's the same size wound with the same minuscule amount of blood, and it's just an inch or two higher, even further away from all the vitals. Still in that same shoulder meat that every protagonist who has to take a bullet always gets shot in. It's odd to see such similar wounds treated so differently by the movie's reality. One is a grave, life-threatening injury, and the stab wound is like she got a little pebble flung at her. The film has two major weaknesses, and they are pretty substantial: the sound design and the editing. Neither are horrendous, but they're pretty bad overall. The sound design is weak. The film is far too reliant on stock sound effects. The punches and kicks actually sound fine for the most part, but when something breaks, or a car goes by honking, or especially when a door opens, it's a stock sound that you've certainly heard dozens of times before and cheapo productions. The problem with these sounds isn't just that they're overused, it's that they're bad sounds to begin with. They literally use the shattering pottery joke sound effect from Wet Hot American Summer in the middle of an action scene. It fully took me out of the moment. But the absolute worst is that awful squeaky door sound effect. Listen to that. It sucks, man. It always sucks in every film that uses it, which is far too many. That sound effect's not appropriate for anything other than an old hatch on a submarine flinging open. But this movie uses it for any door opening, any piece of metal moving, really. They seriously used it over and over and over again. And there's one scene where they use that exact same sound effect 4 times in a row. 4 times in a row. The sound effects in the brief gunplay moment are also stock gunshot sounds, and they're bad too. Better sound design overall would bring this film up an entire level. The other weak area is the editing. Now, the editing isn't all bad. It's more of a mixed bag than the sound was. Thankfully, the worst of the editing manages to stay out of the action sequences, which is a serious relief. It doesn't go all frantic, quick cut like crappy American action films. There were a couple moments in the choreography that were cut just a bit faster than I would have preferred, but it's nowhere near Taken 3 or Alex Cross levels for the most part. The fights were all well cut. My problems with the editing were largely contained to the non-action sequences. There are quite a few weird or just awkward moments where things feel off, purely because the editing wasn't as tight as it needed to be. The film has some flashbacks, some of which are necessary, but a number of them aren't at all. There's a moment in an early action sequence where everything pauses and we're shown a shot of what appears to just be an empty forest. I don't know what that is. Right. Then we get a reaction shot from the protagonist, who looks down pensively, deep in thought. Then it cuts to what I was convinced was another flashback, with a bunch of people in a restaurant, bar kind of place. And then our protagonist busts through the wall like the goddamn Kool-Aid man, and the action sequence starts up again. So it wasn't a flashback. It's a weirdly played moment that could easily be fixed through editing. And this type of slowdown in the middle of action sequences happens a couple of times throughout. and it always hurts the flow of the action whenever it pops up. To end on a positive note, the visual style of Furie is one of its greatest strengths. The color palette is especially remarkable. The colors feel perhaps a little John Wick inspired, but really cranked up to 11. Furie is an extremely colorful film with heavy, saturated hues, not just in the lighting, but also in the wardrobe and the set decoration. It looks like this movie takes place inside of a neon sign, and that's pretty damn cool. Furie is a pretty good action flick that I do think has a good chance of bringing in a new audience to the Vietnamese film scene. If nothing else, I hope it leads Veronica Ngo to star in more badass roles. Thanks for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, then leave a like and subscribe to this channel, but don't you dare touch that bell icon. That is my bell, and I don't want any of you touching it. Hands off! Thanks for watching.